Goals, content, and sequencing. Now we're going to discuss the significance of goals and how we can set up the content for a language course and how we can set up its sequencing and what are the dimensions of these three terms, right? So before we proceed, it's important to point out that much of the discussion for this topic comes from Nation and McAllister book, Language Curriculum Design, right? Well, goals, content, and sequencing. Okay, when we think of goals, when we think of content, and when we think of its sequence, naturally we think about the environment in which these three elements are going to take place. Well, the environment, as we have already discussed, is about, some situational or environmental constraints. I mean, it could be the school itself, and it could be the administration, it could be teachers or learners. And then we've got learners' needs as well. And when we decide about, the goals, content, and its sequence or order, we need to take into account various needs of learners. I mean, or in other words, the diverse needs of learners. And then we need to also take into account the principles of language teaching. Since the debate has moved away from the topic of teaching language through methodology to the principled one, so as you could remember, we have already talked about the principled approach to language curriculum design, in which we talked about the 20 principles proposed by Nation and McAllister, right? So content and sequencing, for that matter, we've got a checklist, we've got specific guidelines, and these guidelines give us a perspective, a lens to see the environment. I mean, when we talk about the environment, it entails whether the course, fit for learners' age, whether the course fit for learners' specific proficiency, and whether the course is comprehensible to the teachers, right? And whether the course is the content, goals, and sequencing issues are fit for the overall situation, right? And then another element of content and sequencing is to take into account the needs analysis. When we talk about the needs analysis, we mean to say the lacks of learners' needs, their lacks, their wants, and their necessities, right? And for deciding, content and sequencing, we need to also sort of consider some of the principles of language teaching. These principles, as you know, range from format and presentation, so content and sequencing, and monitoring and assessment. So we could make decisions about these principles, right? What's the focus of the goals? When we talk about, when we determine the goals of the course, so what's it about, what we mean? Since, we have already talked about, the aims and objectives in our earlier sessions. So I'll just briefly go through the focus of goals is, the teaching of the language itself. I mean, teaching language through some ideas and also inculcating some skills and approach to read the text. Yeah. Okay. So the content, the decision how to select the content for of a specific syllabus. So it could be based upon, you know, our decisions about topics, themes, and situations, right? I mean, topics, it could be topical syllabus, and it could be thematical syllabus, or it could be situational syllabus. I mean, explaining the situation in or teaching language in a specific context. So while in brief, while making decisions about goals, content, and sequencing of a language course, we need to make justified decisions. And since, you know, if for example, if we choose poor content, no matter we've got excellent teaching staff, they might not be able to realize the goals of that poorly selected content. So this is how, you know, goals, content, and sequencing are the most important elements of language curriculum design.